Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and welcome to the virtual reading group. I see there's a question of if the audio is on. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So welcome. We are reading this wonderful little book edited by Jerome Cohn, Responsibility and Judgment. We're going to read the first half of it on responsibility, really on morality, something that Arendt doesn't always write a whole lot about, and yet she begins to think about later in her career, especially after the Eichmann trial and the reaction to it. We read last week Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, which raises this question of why do we obey and when do we not obey, and really confronts this question of that those who obey in a political system are actually supporting that system. A controversial and important claim, and one that underlies her judgment that Eichmann should be killed, and that Eichmann was clearly in her mind personally guilty and responsible for what he did, even if he was not a monster. And so she's grappling there with this question of the responsibility of people who coordinate and are complicit in evil, and even if they are themselves not wildly evil, not monsters. And she clearly believes that there is personal responsibility here. So this is, we're now moving to the second essay in this book, which is not an essay per se. It's called Some Questions of Moral Philosophy. It was written and given as in two parts, or not in two parts. There was first given as a lecture, 4 lectures, as part of a course at the New School for Social Research in 1965, and then was repeated in 1966 at the University of Chicago under the title Basic Moral Propositions. The text is basically the text of the 4 lectures that she gave at the New School, with some supplements, especially in the footnotes and endnotes from the Chicago lectures. So what is the question? So it's 4 lectures. The text, as it's presented to us by Jerome Cohn, and who edited it, is given to us in 4 parts. We're going to read them part by part. So in a sense, 1 lecture at a time, and we will get through this essay in 4 sessions as a result. We're reading today the first lecture. And what is this first lecture about? It is about why the question of morals or morality has to present itself, or does present itself to us today. Why is it that suddenly we have to think about morals, and how how should we think about the question of morality today? And the fundamental insight here is that we think about morals today partly because they have lost their self-evident character, And thus morality is something that we think about today in its absence or in its problematic weakness, in its shoddiness, as she'll call it. And at the same time, morality presents itself to us not as a political phenomenon, but largely as a question of how to act when one is part of an evil or potentially evil regime. So very much the same kind of questions that she raised in the prior lecture on political responsibility under dictatorship. So she ends the essay, the first part, talking about the real evil, right? And she says the real evil is that which should never have happened. This is on page 75. It's the speechless horror that we confront when we confront something like the Holocaust, or we could even say the terror in Soviet Russia under Stalin. Sorry, I don't have anyone with me today, so I'm letting people in as they come in as I talk. So I apologize. But let's go from the beginning. The beginning starts with Churchill, right? Winston Churchill, who she calls the greatest statesman of the 20th century. And why does she start with Churchill? Because Churchill, she says, was such a contrast to the 20th century. He was almost an embodiment of a pre-modern ideal. She calls it the permanent eminence of the human spirit, flashed up for an historically brief moment in the person of Winston Churchill. He had a kind of laughing courage and nobility and dignity and steadfastness. He could call evil evil. He knew what was right and wrong. And he says in the 1930s, and she quotes him on page 50, he says, scarcely anything material or established, which I was brought up to believe was permanent and vital, has lasted. Everything I was sure or was taught to be sure was impossible has happened. Now, he says this in the 1930s. This is even before the Holocaust. This is even before the fullness of Stalinism. What Churchill is saying is there were basic experiences that morality was thought to be self-evident, that you were brought up and told this is right and this is wrong. This can happen and this can't. And that all of these sort of basic experiences by the 1930s even, let alone the 1940s, had been shown to simply be tenuous, like table manners that could be exchanged for one set of manners for another. You can have French table manners or English table manners or Chinese table manners or whatever it is. And so she starts with Churchill in a sense to give us what she calls a basic experience, right? What is a basic experience? A basic experience is something we just know by looking at it. And what we know by looking at it and what we see in the contrast between Churchill and our world is that morality is a tenuous thing. That morality is no longer something we take for granted or we know for certain. And we have to face that fact. We have to face the reality that morality is tenuous. Now, this fact that she starts with, right, that that morality is tenuous, she says, is something that we've known for a long time in philosophy of morals. And the person who saw this most clearly was Friedrich Nietzsche, who traces the history of morality and shows how morality is really simply a set of standards that serves particular interests, namely the interest usually of the powerful, although who the powerful is changes over time. Morality, especially our Christian morality to the extent, or Judeo-Christian, or you could even say Judeo-Islamic Christian morality for Nietzsche, is a slave morality, one that is imposed by the weak upon the strong, and thus, in a sense, castrates or limits what the strong can do, which just means that the weak have become stronger and have succeeded through their wiles at creating a morality that serves their interests rather than a morality that serves the interest of the strong. But whichever morality it is, whether it's an aristocratic morality or a slave morality, the point is that what Nietzsche showed is that morality is connected to power and is something that is tied to power and not something that is in any way self-obvious or self-certain. Arendt then goes to say that if you want to look at the way in which today, in the 20th century, we see the basic experience that she says we see, the loss of morality, she says you can see it everywhere. You can also see it in Stalinist Soviet Union, but you can see it most clearly amongst the Nazis. Even more so than Stalin, who still tried to hide his crimes and thus shows a kind of commitment to moral behavior. It was the Nazis who simply, and you know, the Nazis also to some degree, to the extent they still got the final solution and other euphemisms, but they much more clearly, in her mind, sought to actually create a new morality, to simply give up Christian morality, give up a kind of slave morality, and create a new master morality. And what the Nazis proved, right, in her mind, is that you didn't need to be a convinced Nazi to do evil. You didn't need to be someone who believed in this new aristocratic morality of Aryan dominance, right, to do evil. This is on page 54. And here's where she now makes, I think, a very important move, and one that all of us are going to have to reflect on and ask yourselves, you know, to what extent is she right? She says the true moral issues that the Nazis raised was not the issue of someone like Hitler or Himmler or Goebbels or Goering. It was not the issue of the mad criminals, because every society has mad criminals. It was the issue of those who coordinated or collaborated with these mad criminals. So on page 54, she says, morality collapsed into a set of mores, not with criminals, but with ordinary people who, as long as moral standards were socially accepted, never dreamt of doubting what they had been taught to believe in. So it was good, law-abiding, moral-abiding, normal people who generally followed what they were supposed to follow and never thought they would be bad, who, when the system emerged in which they were told to do things like arrest innocent people, kill innocent people, gas innocent people, went along with it. And she says that's the moral issue, not Hitler or not Himmler. Well, why? Why is that the moral issue? Because and that's what she's going to explore in this series of lectures, Some Questions of Moral Philosophy. why is it that if we want to talk about morality, we have to talk about why people coordinated with evil. And she, on a quick digression, she says, we have not seen this moral issue because it has lain dormant. This is on page 55. And it was hidden. And what hid it? It was hidden by the naked monstrosity of what happened, the Holocaust, or, Stalin's terror. It was hidden by the fact that there were things that were so awful that they should never have happened, that we cannot reconcile with them. And the awfulness of these things, she says, the Holocaust and things like it, in a sense, dominated our thinking. We couldn't master it. And so we never got to the strictly moral question of why people obeyed, and what makes people obey. That's the question she's interested in. It was also we also were prevented from getting to this moral question, not just by the sheer horror of the Holocaust, but by the emotionality in which we speak about it. And so because we talked about it with such emotion, and emotions cheapen things, but more than that, the overcharge of the emotions leads us to not think very clearly, she says. And so the moral issues were hidden. Well, what brings the moral issues to the fore? What brings them out of this hiddenness? She says, were a series of trials, the post-war trials. That includes Nuremberg, but it also goes, and other trials, and then goes up to the Eichmann trial. And the trials, she said, brought out the moral question, because the question that we had to ask in these trials was, were these people guilty, right? Was Eichmann guilty, right? Were, the people who were the architects and the lawyers and the judges guilty of what they did during the Nazi period? And to ask that, we have to ask about their personal responsibility of the individual person. And so on 58 to 59, she writes, the reason these courtroom procedures could bring to life specifically moral questions, which is not the case in the trials of ordinary criminals, is obvious. These people were not ordinary criminals, but rather very ordinary people who had committed crimes with more or less enthusiasm, simply because they did what they had been told to do. So with ordinary criminals, right, they're actually people doing bad things because they want to break the law. But the problem with the Nazi people was that they were following the law, and they just did what they were told. They followed the law, and not just that they followed orders, right? That's what you can say that if you're in the army, but if you're a bureaucrat or a judge, or you work in the bureaucracy like Eichmann did, you're not just following orders, you're following the law. And so the moral question really becomes, are they personally responsible? Are they guilty for following an unjust law? And what she says is, to ask this question really pisses people off. And she gives two examples: the play by the playwright Hochhuth about Pope Pius XII, where he accuses the Pope of not doing enough, and Hans Morgenthau's writing in the New York Times, in which he says about Van Doren, who was on the quiz show, who cheated, look, this guy was a cheat. And people were outraged, saying, who are you to judge in both these cases? Just like people said to her about her Eichmann book, where she judged the Jewish leaders and some Jews, but also judged Eichmann. People said to her, who are you to judge? And she's saying, well, we have to judge. And these trials brought this moral question. And so the question of these essays is, okay, morality is in retreat. Morality is tenuous. Nietzsche has shown us this, but we've lost this moral feeling. But how can we begin to think about what does it mean to judge? And what does it mean to thus engage in moral thinking at a time when morality has been shown to be no longer a matter of course? And she says this raises three questions. The first question is, she says, we have to just acknowledge what she's already said, which is that morality is no longer a matter of course. We can no longer assume that every sane man knows what is right, regardless of the law, right? If the law says, abortion is legal, right? We can't assume that we all know whether abortion is right or wrong outside the law. If the law says, killing is illegal, or if the law says killing is legal, innocent people, because they're Jews or because they're Black men, we can't assume anymore, she says, that we know what is right. People will follow the law. She said it was traditional that we thought we knew what was right, even if we were tempted to do wrong. But now we can't assume we know what's right. We can no longer assume, therefore, that people will do what is right because they're afraid of self-contempt if they do what is wrong. One danger is, of course, that we can lie to ourselves and tell us we're not really doing wrong. But the bigger issue, she says right now, is that we just no longer seem to know what is right. And the last person, she doesn't say this in this way, but I think she means it, and I'll say it. The last great thinker, in the Western tradition at least, who wrote with the confidence that we could know what is right and wrong, was Immanuel Kant, right? And Kant raised this as a problem, right? Because the problem Kant came up with was the Enlightenment problem, in which he says, I should no longer obey external authorities because I am free. I'm an enlightened subject. And so if I am to follow the law, the moral law, I have to know that the moral law is right. Well, how can I know that the moral law is right? Kant asked. And his answer was that all rational beings, insofar as they're rational, carry the rational law within themselves. And they understand the beauty and the power of that rational law. And insofar as they do, they are in awe of that rational law, and they set it themselves under it. Right? So on page 67 to 68, she says, this comes out most clearly and most beautifully in a famous passage of Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. Quote, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and more steadily we reflect on them: the starry heaven above me and the moral law within me. Right? The starry heaven above me is awesome. But its awesomeness is such that it teaches me what? That I am meaningless. I am a speck in a universe that is much more than any humanity or even all of humanity combined. And so it annihilates me in some way and makes me almost retreat. Whereas the feeling of the moral law within me, and I say feeling intentionally, it's not a derivation. It's a feeling of the moral law within me for Kant, raises my self-worth, because when I feel that I know what is right and wrong, I have an enormous amount of pride. I have an enormous amount of self-respect. I know that I can know what is right, and thus that I am rational, and that I am not just a speck or an animal, but I am almost like a god. And for Kant, therefore, I'm not just someone who knows that I have the moral law within me. I know that I'm the kind of person who, to be who I am, must give that moral law to myself in such a way that I set myself under it and obey it. And so it's not just that I can know the moral law, Kant says, not with religion, not from tradition, not from any authority outside self, but from a feeling in myself. And it's from that knowing it that I then set myself under it and must obey it. And so that's the second aspect. It's the first question she raises is, can I know the moral law? And the last person to say that I can is Kant. Right after Kant, Nietzsche comes along and says, no, the moral law, you can know it, but it's just what you think. It's not the true moral law. Kant still thinks there's a rationality through which we can know it. The second part, which goes on page 68 to 70, Kant says, not only can I know it, but since I am a rational being, and my reason, if I know what is good, I have to will the good. And if I will the good, I have to try to actually do the good. I mean, I may fail because I'm a human, not a god, right? God knows the good, wills the good, and accomplishes the good. But we humans, he says, we know the good, we will the good. We may not accomplish the good, but we're at least going to try to do the good. And thus, I am a legislator. I give myself the moral law. I am autonomous. And by the law of this freedom, which is autonomos, autonomy, I give the law to myself, and I then seek to actualize that law, right? And this is on page 71, where he talks about how the will includes action, right? That is one of the fundamental tenets of Kant's moral philosophy. The third question that she raises, and she says the one that's most shocking and most perplexing, and this is on page 72, is that in almost none of these moral systems do we really talk about people who are intentionally evil, wicked, sadists. She says for Kant, he can't really talk about it because insofar as we're all rational, it's impossible for us to deliberately do wicked things. We can do things that are wrong, but we have to think that they're good. We have to justify them. And so moral thinking doesn't really address what we might call radical evil. Literature, she says, we might think, well, there's great villains in literature, so it should address radical evil. But she says, part of what literature does is in making great villains, it makes them interesting and gives them a kind of nobility from despair. They do evil from despair, whether you're Iago or Billy Budd or Claggart, right? And insofar as you or even Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov, right? I mean, God, the man is evil, but he's doing it out of a sense of rational thought that is sort of also compelling. And so she says, even in the literature, we don't address just plain old radical evil. That's different, she says at the very end of section 1 on page 75, from evil done in the real world, right? Because in the Nazis, there's no nobility to it. It's utterly, she says, this kind of nobility is utterly absent from the real thing at the bottom of 74 to 75. And thus, according to Nietzsche, the man who despises himself respects at least the one who despises. There's a kind of nobility still. But in the real evil, she says, this is the last sentence, but the real evil is what causes us speechless horror, when all we can say is this should never have happened. And so the real evil is that which we simply cannot even contemplate, cannot even think, cannot master. And all we can do is say this should not have happened and throw them off a cliff, put a millstone around the neck and throw them into the ocean. And this is what she says about Eichmann at the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? That Eichmann was so evil, not in the sense that he was wicked, but that he was so completely banal, so thoughtless that he had no morality whatsoever. He couldn't even conceive of respect. And he was a manifestation of such speechless horror that we cannot reconcile with allowing him to continue to be in the world. And we have to just execute him, kill him, expunge him from humanity as someone who was part of this system in such an unthinking way. And this is sort of the way she frames this question of thinking about questions about moral philosophy, right? That moral philosophy is about the fact that we have to acknowledge that morality today is tenuous and is not self-evident. We have to acknowledge, therefore, that when we talk about moral conduct, we're talking about, in a sense, following my own will, my own rational will. But my rational will could also be a non-rational will. But we also have to understand that when you fully abandon that your moral responsibility to, in a sense, check the laws of our period with a kind of rational morality, you become so banal, so thoughtless, so not rational that you evoke speechless horror. And then you just have to be eliminated. At least that's what she thought about Eichmann. So that's what I understand to be the beginning of this essay on some questions of moral responsibility, this lecture series, and lecture one. So let's sort of have our conversation about it. Remember, there's two ways to join the conversation, right? One is in the chat, which seems to be open. Is it not open? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can open it. All right, I opened it. I apologize for that. As I said, I'm alone today, so I'm not able to do everything at once. The chat should now be open, right? No? Yes? Can you all? Yeah, great. I apologize, but you can engage in the chat. Please be respectful. You can also go down to reaction button at the bottom of your screen, click on it and click on raise hand and engage with us in the discussion. Welcome. Bob, how are you doing?
Doing just fine. Thanks, Roger. Trying to understand in what sense two passages are met. So the first one on page 62, where she's talking about Kant and radical evil being a temptation to inclinations, by which I I take Trump in our area, and our age. And then the second on page 72 at the bottom, where she says it is impossible for man to do wicked things deliberately, to want evil for evil's sake, by which I take as an exemplar Hitler and the people around him. You opened the session by saying that they wanted to replace Christian morality with a new Nazi morality, which seems to me to be evil for evil's sake, or maybe not so much for evil's sake, but I think in our common parlance, this would be radical evil. So my question is she just talking about most people, and we don't have to worry about Trump so far as understanding what kind of evil he does. And maybe we don't have to worry about Hitler and his inner circle, because despite the fact that he had so many followers, he's so far beyond the pale of what most people think when they think of evil. So I'm asking how to understand these two passages.
Thanks, Bob. It's a really important question, and so let me see what I can do to unravel it. So on 62 in the passage you turned us to in about 2/3 of the way down, what she's saying here, right, is that moral conduct is not a matter of course, right? But moral knowledge is, for Kant, right? Now, part of what the argument of this whole first lecture is that moral knowledge has also ceased to be a matter of course today, right? That's part of her argument. But sticking with Kant makes a distinction between moral knowledge and moral conduct. And what he says is, all of us have moral knowledge. And we can't just ignore it and do evil, because we would lose all our self-respect. We would say, I'm doing evil, and we would lose that. And so for Kant, what evil is, and what radical evil is not seeking to do evil. It's being tempted to do wrong by your inclinations, even though you know what is right. And he's, because inclinations and temptations are rooted in human nature, though not in human reason, Kant called the fact that man is tempted to do wrong by following his inclinations radical evil, right? Even the thief knows that you shouldn't steal, right? And he wants people not to steal from him. He makes a temporary exception because, well, no one cares about that little chalice over there. I care about it, so I'll take it. So for Kant, the thief knows you shouldn't steal. He makes an exception and gives into temptation. He can lie to himself. He can deceive himself. But he still believes in following the law. You can say, with Donald, your example was Donald Trump, and we can use him or someone else. If you're going to justify putting people in cages at the border, it's wrong. I mean, Donald Trump knows it's wrong. Joe Biden knows it's wrong, and they're both doing it, right? They're giving into temptation. They're rationalizing it, not because they're evil, but because they've given into temptation. That's the Kantian reason. And thus, so it's actually impossible for man to do wicked deliberately, because that would be, in a sense, to deny our humanity, at least for Kant. What she's saying, I think, right, is that today, that Kantian confidence that we all know what is right, that we all are rational, is not something we can take as a matter of course. So, it's not clear that today, we can still think the same way Kant thought, right? That no one can do evil deliberately. I think she, did Hitler do evil? Was Hitler wicked? Is he doing evil for evil's sake? I mean, it's an important moral question to raise, right? You can say, yes, he was trying to wipe off certain groups of people from the face of the earth. You can say, no, he didn't want to wipe off people from the face of the earth. He just needed to wipe these off to get his goals. But I think her view, and I think she's right, is that no, he was just wicked. And I think that's the Churchillian moment that she's talking about. We've lost this sense that people are not wicked, that everyone knows what is right and wrong. So the second passage you cited on 72, where she says, the evasion, the sidestepping, or the explaining away of human wickedness, if the tradition of moral philosophy is agreed on one point from Socrates to Kant, as we shall see, to the present, then that is that it is impossible for man to do wicked things deliberately, to want evil for evil's sake. This whole tradition of moral philosophy can't think of it that way. I take it to be, what I'm trying to suggest is, her claim at the end is that in the real evil of today, we are witness to things that are so monstrous, that create such speechless horror, that they are wicked and radical evil, not in the Kantian sense of giving into temptation, but simply radical evil. And when we see that and confront that, we cannot reconcile to it. We can't punish it. We can't reconcile to it. We have to non-reconcile. We have to, throw it off the earth, right? This is actually, a part of Arendt's work that I've written a lot about. And I mean, the idea of non-reconciliation in Arendt, which I mean, I've been one of the people to really first write about, is absolutely at the core here, right? That there are things that cannot be reconciled. And I take it to be the argument here that this is part of the 20th century idea, the loss of tradition, including the loss of the moral tradition, in which now there is a new kind of radical evil, things that are wicked, monstrous, and can't be reconciled. Thanks, Bob. Is that all right? Yeah.
Pretty much. So I guess she's talking about two different things. Maybe in the first passage, she's talking as Kant understood it. And in the second passage, as she understands it. So, for example, you take somebody like Charles Manson.
Like who?
Charles Manson.
Uh-huh.
Or the Zetas in Mexico, who require that somebody does evil in order to establish their bona fides for the group. So in her understanding, these two examples are not to be reconciled and they ought to be thrown in the ocean if he could do it. So I guess, thank you, unless I've got this wrong.
Well, I think there's a way in which I think you've got it right. I mean, all I'll say is, you know, she thinks that it's a question today, right? A perplexity, as she says on 72, about this evasion and this claim that there is no evil for evil's sake. You know, does you know, take your pick? Does Charles Manson, does Donald Trump, does what's the guy's anyway, you know, do these people, are they doing evil for evil's sake? You know, one way to test it is, do they still believe that morals should apply to people doing things to them? Right? I mean, I don't know Charles Manson well enough to answer that question, right? Does Charles Manson believe that he and his followers should have the right to be protected by the law? Right? You know, depends how you want to read Donald Trump, right? You can read Donald Trump as someone who's simply making exceptions, or you can read Donald Trump in a truly radical way and say he honestly doesn't believe in any good or evil. He believes only in power. And in the end, Donald Trump would respect the criminal who shot him or who killed him, because, or who defeated him, because Donald Trump sees that all morality is just about power. And if all morality is just about power, you know, Donald Trump really doesn't care if someone comes around and beats him up. I think you can make that reading of Trump as a pure power-based nihilist. You know, he's probably inconsistent. He's not a consistent thinker, but there's an element of him that I think you can read that way. And in that sense, he would, to the extent he does evil things, he would be wicked and evil for evil's sake. Okay. James. James, are you muted or not?
I'm here. Two encounters, recent encounters for me. The article in the New York Times Magazine about the 3 photographers who took pictures of the Sandy Hook massacre. They have 14,000 images that they're not allowed to show. The account of the class of 15 kids being piled into a closet with their teacher, and the shooter pumping 80 rounds into that room, and these photographers taking pictures because this is their job, of the assembly of whatever was left there. The horror of that we refuse to see, we refuse to look at, we refuse to confront the evil, we refuse to tolerate looking at it. And simultaneously, this Mamie Till sharing her son's condition in a public casket that resulted in, I feel, a part of America confronting the evil because they see it, they confront it, they deal with it. I don't think this is too far away from your comments just now about Donald Trump. But we have to face the horror. Is she advocating that we face the horror and digest the horror and make the horror part of our being? Or is she saying we just have to see that some people will face it and some people will not?
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think that is, you know, I think that
I
is
don't
what,
think it's speechless. I don't think it's speechless. Do you think it's speechless?
well, to the extent we suppress it and don't talk about it and don't confront it, it's speechless.
But Mamie Till was not speechless. She put it out there. Whoa.
Yeah. That's true. The horror, I mean, what is the horror, right? That is speechless. I mean, it's something that I'm still grappling with. But for her, I think what is most horrific is this collaboration and complicity, this coordinating of action. And we don't confront that. We hide it behind emotions, right? And behind all this other kind of stuff, performance, and things. So her point is that we simply don't want to look at the real horror, which is the breakdown of morality. And what allowed this horror to come out was the courtroom drama, where we were sort of forced to ask about people's personal responsibility. There is a horror, obviously, in the Holocaust, and there is a horror in what happened to Emmett Till, and there is a horror what happened at Sandy Hook. I think the speechless horror she's talking about is all the people who coordinated and were complicit and let it happen in these things, and thus are part of the breakdown of morality.
Isn't that what we're doing when we refuse to look at the photographs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we refuse to look at the photographs, I mean,
Or refuse to
I think people refuse to look at the photographs for different reasons. But I don't think someone is guilty for not looking at the photographs. I mean,
yes, that's right.
If the photographs are hidden because we don't want to let people look at them, right?
Yes.
Because we don't want to allow a confrontation with the situation, then there can be a matter of guilt and personal responsibility.
Well, isn't that what's going on almost every day in our culture now? We get every day.
Look, there's always going to be people who, I mean, every system, whether it's a university or a corporation or a government, needs people to help run it. And to some degree, they have to, look away from things they don't like in order to be good administrators or bureaucrats or whatever it is. That's, we all are complicit in things in which we probably don't agree with everything the organizations we're part of does or do. That said, are we so complicit in something that's evil? And, most of us would say most of the organizations we're part of, they may not be perfect, but they're not evil. I mean, I hope, maybe you would disagree, but, and so,
if we step back and refuse to engage and put an organization between us and the evil, aren't we insulating ourselves from taking responsibility for that?
Well, yeah, if you think it's evil, I mean, you have to tell me what the organization you're talking about is.
Right.
Is the United States of America an evil country, right? So evil that to help run the court system or help run a train system or a transportation system is to be complicit in evil? Or is it, a country that is imperfect I think you have to make those decisions. And, each one of us has to make those judgments, right? Was it, was when Charles Van Doren cheated on Quiz Show in order to, take the money that they were offering him, was he just doing something, mildly, deceptive, but not problematic? Or was he engaging in a kind of larger evil? And that's the kind of question that we need to ask. I mean, what she's saying is we generally have a sense of what is evil and what is not. And it, I think many of my students would say the United States government is evil. My guess is most people on this call don't want to go that far. I could be wrong. I don't want to put it in words, people's mouths. But it's an important question to raise for yourself and have a judgment on.
Thanks.
Yep. Susan.
So I think this follows from that a little bit. I'm always struggling with her concept of the banality of evil, which she says she is not saying every one of us is capable of this. But in this discussion, she certainly seems to be saying a lot of people are capable of this. Many, thousands, millions of people collaborated and cooperated. And really the rare few, the conscious pariahs that she cites, the rare few refuse to. So that seems like hard. I'm always struggling to understand where she's drawing the lines.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, when she says in the Eichmann book, right, the line that maybe more than any other line, maybe even more than the banality of evil, got her into trouble, right? That the greatest tragedy of this whole horrific situation, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact line, maybe someone has it, they can jump in, but the greatest sort of evil or tragedy of this whole situation was that it was so awful and so destructive of humanity that even the Jews collaborated and coordinated in their own destruction. What she means by that is not that the Jews were more at fault than anyone else, right? It's that the complete destruction of morality, the deprivation of human rationality and human and human pride was such that even the victims, the Jews, and the people who'd traditionally been a moral people and were victims, were made to complicit and to collaborate. And so, yeah, I mean, what she found truly horrific, what she found truly sadist or wicked, the speechless horror, more so than the actual killing, which has happened throughout history, right, was complicity and the extent of that complicity. And so you're right. Now, you're also right that she wants to say this is not a fate. Not everyone has to act this way. Stanley Milgram tells you, oh, this is what humans do. They obey unjust laws. And her view is no, there are still people who don't, and all of us have it in our power not to. But we've increasingly living in a world in which we're not willing to judge people who do coordinate and do comply with evil. And her argument is we have to be able to and willing to judge. We have to be willing to say these people, even if there are millions of them, were wrong. And when people say, who are you to judge? Her answer is, I'm someone who believes that to be human is to have a spark of reason in myself, such that I have the pride, the self-respect, the ego to set myself above what other people are doing. And that if I give into what other people are doing, I'm just giving into temptation. So yeah, millions of people did it. And the tragedy of that situation, of the Holocaust and of Stalinism, and is how many people did and how it was seen as something we maybe say is wrong, but we can't condemn. And what she's saying is, what the trials did is force the question and remind us that there is, even then, a right to condemn, a right to judge. Not because they broke the law. In fact, they followed the law, but because they were immoral in complying with unjust laws. Is that all right? Is that Ken?
I'm glad you brought that up, Susan. In following the discussion, it seems like in all of her work, she's really concerned with how our world is created and not really individual acts. So she seems like, I think she said she's more interested in the Nuremberg trials or Eichmann than she was in the Frankfurt trials, which were concerned with like the sadists at Auschwitz and the sort of low down sadists. I don't think she spent a lot of time considering that. I think she says that somewhere, I forget. But I wish we had her book on judgment, because it seems like what this essay concerns mostly is where she was going with judgment, which had to do with when the world, the cultural sense, or the broadly cultural sense, or the sense as communist, is upside down when it says thou shalt kill, as opposed to thou shalt not kill. And it's actually opposed to common sense at that point. She's doing something she's taking Kant to really a big step further, saying reason isn't just something we could do, something we could not do. She's putting it as part of willing, something we could do, something we could not do. But she's saying reason is often absent, and we're just following what other people are doing. We're human, we're social creatures, we're following the sensus communis. And when it gets turned upside down, the question is, how do we find our bearings there? And I think she doesn't appeal to reason, right? She says the people who didn't cooperate in Hitler's Germany were not the people who said, oh, should I do this? Should I not? Yeah, maybe not. She said there were the people who just said, I can't do this. It was like a visceral reaction, right? It was not what does she call it? An obligation or something, not a question for them. And these questions seem really important to me now. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is so Eichmann, when the ideology collapses, but the people are just following their orders. So Eichmann didn't kill people because he was anti-Semitic. She believes that, I think, and I think it bears out in the court case. He killed people because he was following orders. And she reflects on this on page 43, which was last week, but I think it's something that's been haunting me for a couple reasons. One is because I think it describes Eichmann, but one of the things that's been really concerning me is the sort of microcosms in the United States, and particularly the police, where thou shalt kill Black guys, thou shalt kill for the sake of authority. Seems like it's not the rule through all the police forces, but certainly in the Memphis police it was. And so I just wanted to read this one paragraph that I think applies to both. She wrote, it's on top of 43. It must be realized that although these mass murderers acted consistently with a racist or anti-Semitic, or at any rate, a demographic ideology, the murderers and their direct accomplices more often than not did not believe in these ideological justifications. For them, it was enough that everything happened according to the, quote, will of the Führer, which was the law of the land, in accordance with the, quote, words of the Führer, which had the force of law. And when I'm reading that, it's not hard to say it was enough that everything happened according to the will of the Memphis police, which was the law of the land, in accordance with the words of the Memphis police, which had the force of law.
So let me jump in, Ken, because there's a lot here, and you've raised some important questions. But I'm gonna push back on a couple of points, and they're important, right? So you said that her point in Eichmann was that he was following orders. And I just want to be very clear, that's specifically not her point. She argues precisely against that. She says that's what the people at Nuremberg said. She says that Eichmann said he was following the law, right? Which is not the same as following orders. And she says the same thing in the passage you read on 43, right? The will of Führer, which was the law of the land. Now, it's an important point because when you're following orders, right, in the military or in a police department, you can still find an external authority above your orders, which is the law, right? So in the United States military, it is the law of the United States that if your commander gives you an unjust order, you must not comply. It's actually the law of the United States. And you're supposed to, refuse and even report them. Now, obviously, there's, a lot of effort amongst the military to create loyalty and things that doesn't do that. But just to use your example of the police department in Memphis, there is no law in this country to shoot and kill anyone, let alone Black people, and thank God, right? There may be official or unofficial orders to act in such ways, but those orders are illegal. And there's a big difference between following orders and following laws. That's one thing to point out.
I'm sorry if that's what it sounded like I said. That's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say was that what he was following was the sensus communis, which was upside down. He was following not the law of the land so much as the inverse morality of the land.
Well, but in this case, the law of the land, the inverse morality was the law of the land, and that's part of her point, is that Eichmann defended himself saying, I was a Kantian, right? I'm not going to put myself above the law. And the law said, do this. And who am I to judge? That's how he actually defended himself on the stand.
No.
And so now what she's saying is, even when the law says is upside down and tells you to do things, as a dignified person, you have to resist. But that's much harder. And so we just have to acknowledge that it's much harder. There was a lot else that you said, but that was sort of what I just wanted to make sure we acknowledge that. So, this is not a critique or anything. I'm just saying, for her, it's one thing to say, I'm following orders. And she says we have to be willing to, in that case, we can say, well, the orders are illegal. But what about when they say I'm following the law? You can't say the laws are illegal. What you have to then say is the laws are wrong.
I didn't mean any way to say that the Memphis police were following the law. I was saying they were.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You have to unmute yourself because I muted everyone. I apologize, Ken. I didn't mean to mute you. I was just.
That's okay. Sometimes I should be muted. But what I think I was trying to say is that not that they were following anything legal at all, but they were following something really perverse that we see across police departments. And it is not as simple as calling it racism. It has to do with the way that they are expressing their authority. Sometimes it's extra legal, and sometimes they use something that she talks about prior to that, which is where she talks about the state using extraordinary circumstances. They use criminal means because their very existence or the maintenance of their power depends on it. Like sometimes it seems more like that, and that can come up in court too, like this idea that the police were defending themselves, which is absurd with Tyree Nichols and partly why it's plaguing me.
Yeah.
But I did not mean to say or imply that they're following.
It's all right. I mean, I'm just trying to make sure we all understand for her where the moral question arises, right?
Yeah. Would
the
you
moral
agree though
question,
that it's arising, if we were going to take the police department as a microcosm, it's arising where that their moral compass is upside down, it has to do with power and God knows what.
Yeah.
But it's that upside down sense in the police department that she's objecting to more than, say, racism. Similar to that's why I brought up Eichmann as saying it wasn't his anti-Semitism that drove him so much as following an upside down sensus communis, an upside down world.
Okay. Yeah. I appreciate that. Let me move on because we're running out of time. I see a lot of hands, and I'm actually gonna have to end 5 minutes early today. So, George, you're up next.
I'll be brief. Again, I think if Arendt was really a survivor of Hitler's Germany, so she falls under Primo Levi and Borowski's, especially Borowski's categories. There's no such thing as an innocent survivor. So we're talking here about degrees of guilt. And hers is low. She happens to be in America. We have no idea how she would have acted if she were in Auschwitz. That said, it all goes, that same rule applies to us at the present time. For instance, you, Roger, are less guilty or more innocent than I am because you're more active in protesting whatever is bad in the country, in the situation. I sit here and I intellectualize it. So it's, again, remembering that part of it, that in the Holocaust, the good people are all dead. The survivors all have a certain degree of guilt.
You know, there's a yes and no that comes to my mind, right? I mean, yes, and yet guilt, what do we mean? Are they personally responsible? Would you find them guilty in a court of law?
No, it's not a guilty. It's a question of moral guilt, in a sense that really that you are judging people who are acting in a way that you may be acting in their situation the same way. This is, let's say, when she's judging the Judenrats, etc., things like that. It's really, you have to know that you're judging someone with that lack of innocence hanging over your own head.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, we can make a distinction between what she calls on 73 scandala, right? And vices, right? And there are a lot of people with vices, but we forgive vices. We don't forgive scandals, scandala, great evil. And that's a distinction that she makes in many places in her writing, including in the chapter on forgiveness and the human condition. So worth thinking about. Thank you. Miriam.
Thank you. I was just hoping that Roger, you could, or anybody in the chat could help me think a little bit about different kinds of evil that I have rattling around in my head here. So one, like as illustrated by, literary figures. So Kleigert is one. And Kleigert, it seems to me, is portrayed as being in his own nature, like the scorpion, I think the example is, unable to tolerate somebody like Billy Budd. So he is by nature contrary to a human plurality, if you like. And then my other example is Satan, as he's depicted in Milton. And here, when Satan first sees the new world that God has created, Milton says he stands for a moment stupidly good. And then he goes to work. And he wants to destroy, not because it has any benefit whatsoever to himself, but because he is contra what exists. It is a crime. His crime is against the existential given. And then there's Eichmann. And it strikes me that Eichmann's deeds fall still within the realm of venality, because they have a goal. He wants to play golf with his superiors, or he wants to be liked by his peers, or whatever. There's some, in other words, there is some personal gain to be had. And what is unspeakable about him is the lack of balance. So that in order for him to be liked by his peers, he's going to murder 1 million people. Gee, so it's venality, but venality to the point of grotesquerie, and that seems to me what makes it unspeakable. And then my final point is that in this discussion of morality without a traditional foundation, it seems to me that Arendt proposes in Eichmann in Jerusalem a kind of foundation. When she delivers her judgment on Eichmann, she says, if somebody does not want to share the world with the people that are here, then we can't share the world with them. And so Eichmann has to die. That seems to me a kind of taking plurality as the bottom sense of her, of a morality, seems to me the offering of a kind of a way to create moral judgment for all of those kinds of evil. So that was my query about what you think of those distinctions. And yeah.
Thank you.
I'll mute myself.
No, it's a good question. I mean, she sees but Claggart and Satan as both having a kind of nobility to them. And I think you presented it well. Claggart is envious of Bud, knows that Bud is better than him in his nature, as you rightly put it, and in a sense can't take it, and wants to destroy him. But there's still a sense in Claggart of a desire to be great, that Bud disproves. Satan also has a kind of nobility, insofar as she says he's the light bearer, a fallen angel, right? He's not just his evil, which we might call pure evil, is still the inverse of the light, and has a kind of nobility to it. So she'll say, the fallen angel. In other words, there's a kind of nobility about the real evildoer, at least in literature and in the Bible. This is, she says, utterly absent from the real thing. When you confront a real life, real evildoer, they don't have that kind of nobility. And that's the distinction she makes. And when we confront, she wouldn't say, we should say of Satan, this should never have happened, right? We wouldn't say that, but we would say of Eichmann, he should never have been. And that's the distinction she wants to make.
Because there's a difference between the grotesquerie of the one and the kind of sheer adversarial being of the other, if that's, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
The grotesquerie cannot be spoken because it is so out of balance with everything that we can articulate that we can't get there from here.
Yeah, and moreover, the grotesquerie is in a much deeper way undermining of a world that we can share. So because it makes fun of and it makes light of any attempt to create values, whereas Satan still has values, as does Claggart. All right, quickly, Nancy.
Okay, I will try to be quick. I'm following up on what Ken Landauer said. I just have an increasing concern, and I think there's a lot of parallels to what has happened in other dictatorships. And I'm very concerned right now. I just got another email this morning from the National Lawyers Guild that a law student from North Carolina has just been arrested in Atlanta, fighting Cop City, demonstrating, and her law school in North Carolina has kicked her out. Now, what is this? And from webinars I've been on, there's repression in many places, but there is something that the police force is absolutely more than doubling, quadrupling down on these protests in Atlanta. And it's people who want to protect the inner city forest, Wailani Forest, which is native lands, and not have it turned into a cop training area. And it's, the repression. And no, the press doesn't tell us about Daniel Hale, the drone whistleblower, and Daniel Ellsberg has spoken and said, how did I get better press than he's getting now? So this, and Assange, we're not getting the truth about Assange, a journalist who has been repressed. So I don't know where that, it's hard then to say, am I complicit because I'm not brave enough to go get arrested by the police in Atlanta, and I try to get arrested and nothing happens? Where is all this? What do we do with this?
Well, I mean, I think as George said and others, there's levels of things, and we all have to make our judgments about, where the wrongs are and whether we are, there's one level of enforcing what you consider to be an unjust law or participating in it. And there's another level of, walking across the street and talking about Hannah Arendt, right? Which is a kind of a way of avoiding some of these other issues if you need to go into them. And, in the Brecht poem, An die Nachgeborenen, to posterity, he says, is it guilty? What does it mean to be born into times when, in this case, reading a Hannah Arendt together is an act of complicity? Obviously, I don't think we're in those times, or I wouldn't be here reading Hannah Arendt with you. But you can judge that. And if you think we are in those times, maybe you make time to read Hannah Arendt, but you also go do other things. But those are decisions we all have to make, and we shouldn't we shouldn't be afraid of judging judging these decisions that people make. That said, we should have our decisions judged as well. And I think one of the reasons people are afraid to judge is they're afraid to be judged. But I need to run. I apologize. I'm about to run out of town and catch a train. So I will see you all next week. I look forward to it. We're reading section 2 for next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you soon. Thanks a lot.